be seated at this time.
Have our scripture.
Good morning, church. Good morning. Today's reading will be from Psalm 25, verses 1 through 7. To you, O Lord, I lift up my soul. O my God, I trust in you. Let me not be put to shame. Let not my enemies exalt over me. Indeed, none who wait for you shall be put to shame. They shall be ashamed who are wantonly treacherous. Make me know your ways, O Lord. Teach me your paths. Lead me in your truth and teach me, for you are the God of my salvation. For you I wait all the day long. Remember your mercy, O Lord, and your steadfast love, for they have been from of old. Remember not the sins of my youth or my transgressions. According to your steadfast love, remember me, for the sake of your goodness, O Lord.
So I was stumbling across an old folk artist this week that I hadn't listened to in a lot of years, but I remembered discovering her in college. Her first album came out in the 90s, Dar Williams, and one of the songs she had on the album kind of made her career. It was a song called You're Aging Well. And it was a really interesting one. She was like in her early 20s, I think, when she wrote it, and she was musing on like that transition from the teen years into the college years and young adulthood, and just talking about the idea of what it looks like to age well in those years. But that song got picked up. It got covered by Joan Baez, who was a real well-known folk artist at the time, and it kind of launched her career. And now it's almost 30 years later, she re-recorded the song on this album that she was recording kind of late during COVID, had a lot of drama getting the album out. But I was listening to it. It's the first time I'd heard it this week. And it's like you've got all of these years with all this life experience and all of this age, and now she's singing about what it looks like to age well. And I was reading her talk about that, reflecting on recording that song again, coming back to it after many decades, and just kind of learning to embrace a lot of the new album was her just trying to understand, having to make peace with all of the ups and downs she's had in life, the times where the career's gone great and it's gone terrible, the times that relationships have gone great and gone terrible, and just to figure out what it looks like to age well, to think about that picture, which I think is a great thing to wonder about. Like, what does it look like for us? We're all aging. What does it look like to age well? And that can go well and it can not go well. My baseball team has struggled last year. They were beyond terrible. And one of the reasons why they analyzed that they were just terrible was that they just got too young. They had too many young guys that didn't know how to manage the game, and they just couldn't do it. And so one of their off-season goals was to add a whole bunch of veterans, and they did. They've got like every aged, grizzled guy in the history of baseball suddenly showed up to play for the Cardinals this year. And there they are. They're all out there, and like they're all playing. Like guys that like Cardinals were rooting for in like 2008 are back playing for them. So I mean, they dug up Ozzie Smith and repaired his knees so he could go play for them. So they have a whole bunch of veterans now. And it looked like it was going pretty good, and then suddenly it's not. And so now, as I would explain to Gage, in like Chicago language, they went from being like White Sox terrible to Cubs terrible. And that's just not acceptable for a Cardinals fan. But it's like the problem was the veterans, like they gave a lot of experience and a lot of know-how and a lot of knowledge how to run a season, but then some days they just looked old. And that just didn't work well. So the veteran thing, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And that's true in our spiritual life. What does a spiritual veteran look like? What does it look like to age well as a follower of Jesus? Well, Psalm 25 is really dealing with that question of aging. It's really dealing with the question of maturity. There's a continuity. If you look back at Psalm 24, it's actually really answering one of the key questions of Psalm 24, which is, who shall ascend the holy mountain? Who shall ascend? Who can go up? And it's really looking at us. Here are the people that can approach God. Who can approach God? These are the kind of people that approach God. But it doesn't approach it from a sense of just saying, okay, here's the picture of what we need to strive to be. It is really teaching a picture as it does by modeling a prayer of a mature faith. And that's a really fascinating study. Psalm 25 becomes very unique in that way. There's a few things that are interesting about it. One gets lost to us in translation, which is one of several examples of an acrostic poem. An acrostic in Hebrew typically has the first letter of each stanza starts with the next letter in the Hebrew alphabet. So it moves from Aleph and Bet and Gimel and Dalet. It kind of moves through the Hebrew alphabet. We have several of examples of them. We've had one other in our study this year. Psalm 9 and 10 together are an acrostic. But there's several of them in the Psalms. So, why do you have an acrostic? Well, an acrostic is really good for teaching. It's kind of a simple structure that kind of is catchy, it's memorable, which is the other piece, is it aids memorization. It's easier to memorize things when they're organized that way. So that's a sign that this is a psalm that's meant to teach. There's a couple theological things that people think about with acrostics. Acrostics in Hebrew are conveying, because you move from essentially for us from A to Z, you're conveying the sense of completeness. It's presenting a whole picture. Here's what a believer looks like, or here's what life looks like in the whole of it. But one of the most interesting things is that acrostics are very structured and yet structurally messy, which is what they do is they move, there's a structure, A, B, C, D. It kind of moves through the idea, and yet thematically, you'll have a theme hit in the first stanza that you may not see until the middle, and then you might see it again at the end, and it kind of jumps around on themes because an acrostic is a way of talking about and thinking about spirituality from the perspective of the messiness of life. The themes will come and go because life keeps coming on and keeps moving, and you have to figure out what it is. So I think Psalm 25, as we study it today, it's an invitation for us to think about faith and the journey of faith, and the idea of maturing in faith in the midst of the mess of life. And one of the structures, there's a lot of ways then, because it's an acrostic, because you have all of those layers, it can be hard to say, how do we structure this to really think through this? I like one scholar gave us, I think, a healthy sense of the movement of the psalm, that it moves from petitions to provisions to pressures. And I want us to think about the psalm in that light. So if you don't have your Bibles open, I'd encourage you to open them to Psalm 25. Well, I want to move through the whole psalm. The first section is 1 through 7, the part that we just read, and that's really a series of petitions. Here you have David praying. And what is he praying for? Opening verse, "To you, O Lord, I lift up my soul. O my God, in you I trust. Let me not be put to shame. Let not my enemies exult over me." Now that's a different translation, the one that I grew up singing. "Unto thee, O Lord, do I lift up my soul. Oh my God, I trust in thee. Let me not be ashamed. Let not my enemies triumph over me." That's the one that's ingrained in my head. That's this verse. But the key word there, and it's a key to the section, is this word, shame. "Oh God, in you I trust. Let me not be put to shame." He says it there in verse 2. In verse 3, "None who wait for you will be put to shame. They'll be ashamed who are treacherous." Shame, 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 again and again. Shame is important, so we need to figure out, and that's the first thing I want you to see as we look at these petitions, is that shame is an ordinary concern for believers. Now, what is shame? A lot of times we think about maybe embarrassment today might be the first place we'd go to, being embarrassed. I think that's rooted. Biblically, I think James Montgomery Boyce had, I think, a healthy definition that biblically shame is thinking about trusting in something or someone that proves unworthy of that trust. So you place your stock in something, you invest yourself in a person, and they ultimately prove to be unworthy of that trust. And so you have that sense of being known as the one that trusted in the wrong thing. That's one of I think it's really amusing to look at. There's a whole list of bad sports tattoos that are out there. But the ones that get known is there's almost a thing now of bad sports tattoos where they get the tattoo before they've actually won the thing. So it'd be like the Bears superfan after yesterday's performance goes out and gets Super Bowl 49 Bears champions tattooed on wherever on their body. That's ambition. That's confidence. What's funny about this tattoo above us is, well, it's and maybe you can't quite read the bottom of it. That's the Titans that were the 2017 AFC South champions. The Titans were not the 2017 AFC South champions. That was the Jacksonville Jaguars with a 10-6 record. The Titans had a 9-7 record that year. And the dude is getting this tattoo for something that really doesn't matter. There's like 47 divisions in the NFL. Like, who cares who the AFC South champion is? But boy, he does. Now and forever, he cares about who the 2017. But he's wrong. It proved to be not true. Well, that's kind of what's happening here. God, don't let me be put to shame because I'm trusting in you. And don't let it turn out that you're not worthy of that trust. That's the frame. And that's real. Like that sets you up for what's coming in the psalm, which is to tell you that David is aware that there's problems. And he makes the reference in the opening verses to the enemies. There's a situation that he's in. And some try to read Psalm 25 as a lament. I don't think it's a lament because you never really get lament. But there's problems that he's facing. And his thing is that he is trusting in God, and he does not want that trust to prove unworthy. The next theme, you go to verse 4. What does he talk about? Make me to know your ways, O Lord. Teach me your paths. Lead me in your truth. And teach me, for you are the God of my salvation. For you I wait all day long. You hear all words thinking about the concept of teaching, learning. We need to learn how to trust when it is difficult to understand God's ways. Make me to know your ways. Teaching, learning is key to this piece of what he's about. He needs to trust God even though he doesn't always understand him. Like I remember one of the last songs that Rich Mullins wrote before he died, or performed before he died, was a song called Hard to Get. And he just amuses about all the ways in which he's struggling in faith because God is sometimes hard to get, hard to understand. And it's the last line of the song is he's like reasserting his faith, reasserting he's going to trust him. But he says, it's just your ways and you are just plain hard to get. I don't always understand your ways. Now, I thought it was interesting. Usually in the Psalms, when you come across a line like this, make me to know your ways, the ways in the Psalms are usually thinking about like what I'm supposed to do. Like, show me what the things that I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to order my life. Psalm 1 this is an echo of Psalm 1. It's saying that kind of thing. Here's the wise path. But when you think about wisdom, our ways and paths, there's another dimension that's kind of, I think, in there, captured in the idea, is it's not just the things that I'm supposed to do. It's the journey that God is leading me on. Teach me your ways. Teach me your paths. Lead me in your truth. Because you lead me on this journey. And sometimes the journey's got really great things, and sometimes the journey has some really, really hard things. And it's in those times where the path that he is leading me on, and think about Psalm 23 in the background, this shepherding, as he shepherds us through these paths, can I trust him when it's difficult to understand? I don't get why this is going on. I don't get why this is the thing I have to deal with. And you can have that kind of record in your head. And the assertion of faith here is that, yeah, there's some hard things, and there's some hard paths that he doesn't get, doesn't understand, but I'm going to trust you. Then, seeing that he's trusting him in the midst of this up and down, then you have this next assertion, verse 6 and 7. Remember your mercy, O Lord, and your steadfast love, for they've been of old. Remember not the sins of my youth or my transgression. According to your steadfast love, remember me, for the sake of your goodness, O Lord. I mean, there's probably two words that you hear there, that remember and then the steadfast love. And it's that mercy, verse 6, remember your mercy, that I'd kind of drill us in on it, that we need mercy. We need God's mercy to be able to relate to him. We need we need him to remember his mercy. Treat us in light of his mercy and in light of his steadfast love, his chesed, his kindness. And then don't treat me in light of who I am. As he considers God, as he considers the paths that he's on and some hard paths that he's facing, what it brings to mind is his sin, his brokenness, kind of what Rob was talking about in the opening. Remember not the sins of my youth or my transgressions. And here, from the perspective of a mature faith, he is deeply aware of his failings in the past. And I think this is a phenomenon that is, as we grow, as we move along, as we grow in faith, as we journey on, it's hard not to become more aware of all of our failings from the past. They can kind of pile up on us. I remember a guy I deeply adored who would talk about, he was one of the older guys in our congregation, and would talk about how there's times that he would just weep over remembering some of his sins from the past. And they would just come upon him in surprising ways. And it was just, he was having to re-engage the gospel in those moments, to just recognize, like, I can't believe I did that. And as he's gotten to know the Lord more, he's like, I really can't believe I did that. And he can be filled with shame and defeat, and I've talked to several folks that reach that place where that's what they do. They give in to that. But he was really seeking to exercise the grace and the mercy of God, to remember the grace and the mercy, and to see himself in light of God's mercy, not in light of just all of those sins of his youth, the past failures that were looming large. Remember not. And one scholar writes about this picture here is what he's leaning on, David is leaning on, is the amnesia of divine forgiveness. Because that man, as he's sitting there late in his life, remembering all of those sins, one scholar was painting this picture I thought was useful, is to think about him walking along the beach with Jesus, and he's got that moment where he's remembering that stuff, and he's like, Jesus, do you remember when I did that? And he starts listing all those things, and Jesus' answer would be, nope, I don't remember that. But do you remember this? Remember that time I did that to that guy, or that time that I failed there? It's like, nope, I don't remember that. That's the amnesia of divine forgiveness. That's what David is leaning on here. God, don't remember the sins of my youth. Just forget about it. But that's what God says. He says, as far as the east is from the west, I'm going to separate you from your sins. He doesn't remember because his posture toward us is not this laundry list of all of our faults and failings. His posture for his children as he looks upon us is a posture of love and kindness because of his great love and his great mercy. And that's what I want you to see even in this petitions section, is this final point, is that it's in Jesus that these petitions are finding their fulfillment. This is a psalm where there's actually, Psalm 25 is, to my understanding, is not ever quoted in the New Testament, but boy, its fingerprints are everywhere. It's all over. The gospel is all over these pages. In Jesus is taking on the shame of the world. That theme of shame is vital in understanding the cross in terms of his suffering and the scorn that he takes on. He's taking on shame and suffering and doing it on our behalf, doing it on the part of the world in some sense, and then most deeply on the part of his church, on the part of us. He's taking on that for us. And as he is in a resurrection, as he is being vindicated, the Father is being proven faithful. Jesus is not being put to shame as he entrusts himself to the Father's path. That's Psalm 25 imagery, right? God's path is mystifying. The disciples do not understand why Jesus is going through this. It's a mystifying path, but that path brings a glorious salvation. He is extending mercy to all of those who will look to him in faith. Trust me, and you will not be put to shame. He comes for the sinner, not for the righteous. There's all of these gospel elements in these petitions. But then you move, in verse 8, you move from petitions to provisions. And so what does he say there? He says, he just gives this statement about who God is, a whole bunch of statements. Good and upright is the Lord. Therefore, he instructs sinners in the way. He leads the humble in what is right and teaches the humble his way. God is faithful to those who trust him in humility. You hear that language, humility, the humble, keeps showing up. It's one of those echoes. The faithfulness of God is paired with the humility of his children. God is faithful. We're called to humility. Faith then becomes a kind of expression of humility or dependence. And I think that's the angle that maybe we can understand. What is this humility we're called to? We're called to just recognize we're not independent creatures. And that language is so deeply ingrained in our culture, in our day and age, that your independence and individuality and self-expression, that's the heart of it all, right? Just let me do what I want. It's my time. It's my body. It's my time, my talents, my money. Let me alone. Let me do all these things. But for a Christian, our fundamental posture is not being independent and being individual. It's that we are dependent, that we are dependent on God as our source. Humility is our source of sustaining strength. And that humility is our way of learning from him. He leads the humble in what is right. He teaches the humble his way. 4 through 6, he was calling out for instruction. That is answered here as he teaches the humble. But David is asking here from a place of confidence that this is something that God provides. That's really a defining characteristic of this psalm, a psalm of a mature faith. That he is not saying, God, I don't know if you're going to do anything with this. But constantly, even as he reflects on the problems that he's facing, he is sure of the character of God and can lean on and depend on the character of God. That's a picture of a mature faith. Go on from there, verse 10. All the paths of the Lord are steadfast love and faithfulness for those who keep his covenant and his testimonies. All the paths of the Lord. Now think about that. God's paths are where we learn more about his good character. But from his perspective, from the place of maturity, all of the paths. That's why I say this is why some scholars pick up, this is not just talking about activity, but this is the stuff that's happening in your life, those ups and downs. And so when you're in that pit, when you're on the downside of the roller coaster, you're going down, you can say all of the paths. Like this stuff that's going on right now is a place where I can experience the steadfast love and the faithfulness of God. That's encouraging. We need to hear that because there's times when we get in the pit, we can say, well, this is all terrible. I don't know where God is. I don't know what's doing. A lot of the laments talk about, they feel that space. A lot of the laments in the Psalms give us that space to say, there's times that I feel like it's not there. But from Psalm 25, from that position of maturity, there's this objective truth that can shape and color his subjective experience, his feelings. Yeah, it feels like a pit right now. But this is a space where I will experience the steadfast love and the faithfulness of God. It strengthens us in the midst of the hard paths. Then we go to verse 11. For your name's sake, O Lord, pardon my guilt, for it is great. Who is this man who fears the Lord? Him will he instruct in the way that he should choose. His soul shall abide in well-being, and his offspring shall inherit the land. The friendship of the Lord is for those who fear him, and he makes known to him his covenant. My eyes are ever toward the Lord, for he will pluck my feet out of the net. God here restores his children to a place of restful friendship. In the midst of the pit, when the times are hard, what is he anchored in? He's anchored, one, in verse 11, with the reality that God will act for his name's sake. Forgiveness and what God extends and the mercy that he gives to his children is tied to his character. It is not tied fundamentally to our worth. It's not tied fundamentally to our performance. Jonathan Edwards wrote about this psalm, and what he wrote is he noticed here that David is making this plea for forgiveness not based on his inherent worth, not based on the smallness of his claim. He says, well, God, I haven't done too much, so can you forgive me that? No, he makes the claim entirely based on the mercy and the grace of God. It's God's character that's being revealed. I can be forgiven much. In fact, if I am forgiven much. And that we are forgiven much because of His goodness. For your name's sake, pardon my guilt, for it's great. I've got a great claim. This is a mess that I've created in my life. This is a mess that I have. I need your grace. I need your mercy for your name's sake. And it's a pattern here that he's introducing from a mature perspective of maturity is not that you suddenly stop sinning, but that you're seeking forgiveness. You're continually aware of your sin. You recognize your need for grace. You recognize your need for His forgiveness, and you are learning how to abide, rest in that provision. His soul shall abide in well-being, and his offspring shall inherit the land. Now, what David is describing is something going on. Again, we don't always know the details, but he's at a place in his life where he's in a pit. There's a lot of bad things happening, and in that pit, what he is asserting is that because I have this relationship with God, that I'm in a place where I can rest and say it is well. It is well with my soul. I can rest in well-being, and his offspring shall inherit the land, which is to say that you are resting in a relationship that is ongoing. It's like he has secured something for himself and on for the generations. It's a picture of a place of security. The land has been secured for the generations. He's abiding in that provision. And it's even more than just resting, but it's also this picture of friendship. Verse 14, it's an interesting translation. The friendship of the Lord is for those who fear Him. And if you don't have friendship there, you probably have something like secret counsel. And you might have actually a footnote of one or the other. But that's a picture of what friendship is, that it's an idea that God has drawing His people in. He is drawing them into an inner counsel. He is making known this covenant, this relationship. God has bound Himself to His people. And this inner circle that He has drawn His people into can sustain us, even in the midst of the pit, even when the hard times are there. So much so that the last thing he utters in that section is that my eyes are ever toward the Lord, for He will pluck my feet out of the net. It's not that I've got my security with God, now I can kind of look down and pull myself up by the bootstraps and get myself out of this mess. It's that I can trust His provision so much that my position now is to focus on looking to Him in faith and resting in His goodness and His provision, knowing that He can get me out of this mess. He can pluck me from the net. He can rescue me when I cannot rescue myself. Plucking my feet. Yahweh is our source of rescue. And again, this is a section where Jesus is all over this. Jesus is where we ultimately find God's greatest provision for us. Jesus comes for the humble. That theme of humility runs through the gospel, runs through the New Testament. All who are weary and heavy laden, take my yoke upon you and I'll give you rest. Romans 8:28, all things work together for good for those who love God and are called according to His purpose. You can trust Him. And whatever the paths you're going on, you can trust Him. And even that theme of friendship, John 15 is worth a lot of study on its own, but he talks about in John 15, Jesus talks about abiding. Abide in me and I in you. And he says, I have called you friends. And that friendship is a key sense of identity that he calls us to as we relate to him. We relate to him as friends. He has welcomed us as friends and calls us to rest in him. So having given those petitions and kind of laid out those provisions, now he thinks about the pressures that he's facing. Turn to me, he says, verse 16, and be gracious to me, for I am lonely and afflicted. The troubles of my heart are enlarged. Bring me out of my distresses. Consider my affliction and my trouble, and forgive all my sins. Now just think about right there, affliction and trouble. You hear it different, repeating here in those opening verses. Affliction and trouble will accompany believers along the way. That's an important thing to assert. If you want to have a picture of what mature faith looks like, is that it's that steely-eyed recognition that if you're going to follow God, if you're going to be a follower of Christ through the years, you are going to encounter trouble. You're going to have some hard times. It's going to come. There's a lot of, I think, false gospels that try to traffic in selling us that that's not true. That's like versions like prosperity gospel, which kind of run through our culture. It runs through Africa. It runs through a lot of places in the world. It's always it's an alluring concept. You know, if you have some slick preacher with like, you know, $5,000 suit and a mansion and a plane, and they got this palatial church building and bunch of rings and jewelry, and he's saying, hey, if you follow God, you can be great. It's hard not to buy into that. It's like, well, maybe if I just throw him some money, maybe it'll all go great for me too. And that's just a lie. If you're going to follow God, you're going to have some hard problems. There's going to be some challenges. The troubles remain. And here in Psalm 25, the troubles remain even after all these assurances. So the mature faith is recognizing that the troubles will still be around. It's not expecting them all to go away. We're not going to expect paradise on earth. But there is a confession here, that acknowledgement that God equips us to walk well in the midst of those troubles. We can walk in faith and experience rest and joy and abundance in the midst of whatever the troubles we might face. Consider how many are my foes, and with what violent hatred they hate me. O guard my soul and deliver me. Let me not be put to shame. There's that shame again. For I take refuge in you. May integrity and uprightness preserve me, for I wait for you. The foes language that happens in this section intrigue me. In our troubles, here's the idea I want you to see, is that we contend against the enemy without and the enemy within. There's a pairing. Verse 19, consider how many are my foes, the violent hatred they hate me. And then the next verse, oh, guard my soul. Deliver me. Let me not be put to shame, for I take refuge in you. There's a back and forth here, and we've seen it throughout the psalm. This crying for forgiveness early on, remember not sins of my youth, comes as he's thinking about the enemies out there. So there's an awareness of the enemies without, those people that are causing him problems, paired with his need to be sustained because of the real enemy, which is the enemy within. It's my own sin and my struggle. And a lot of times there's a temptation to want to externalize our enemies. Our real problem is those folks out there. I think that was Jean-Paul Sartre, a philosopher, says hell is other people. Like, that can be our belief. You know, it's those people are the problem. That's the world of politics. We externalize all the enemies. All the enemies are across the aisle. It's those folks that are the problem. And if we can get rid of them or defeat them, we'll all be fine. And there's, you know, anytime you look at that kind of stuff happening, it's hard not to just be aware of the just shocking level of blindness to the people's own problems. They kind of deny their own faults. And that's what the psalm is so aware of. Yeah, he's got problems. Yeah, those people are issues. He's got issues out there. There's issues. But the deeper issue is what's inside him and his own struggle with sin. And so he needs to be preserved in waiting on God in the face of these external pressures and against the weight of the sin that rests within his own heart. And it's that awareness of the enemy within and the need for the gospel to come alive in both contexts is so vital as we press on to maturity. And that's the last piece I want you to see in this section, how Jesus then becomes our rescue in the midst of that pressure. The last word, verse 22, redeem Israel, O God, out of all his troubles. All of this reflection about all of his personal stuff is not just about his personal stuff. It's not just about the individual. He needs to be redeemed, but he needs all of Israel to be redeemed, which in our language, he needs all of the people of God to be redeemed. Redemption is the work of the gospel, and redemption is not just applied to a whole bunch of individuals, it's applied to the people. It's applied to all of us as he gathers his people together. And Jesus is vindicating his followers, proving worthy as he triumphs over sin and death. and leading us through the jungle of the challenges we have out there and the challenges we have in here into better things. Jesus is guiding us into redeeming the whole of our lives and as a guide for us in all of life. So the simple message I leave you with today is to let Jesus teach you the way to maturity. As you think about the picture, like what do you learn from the prayer of a mature faith? I think you have to just acknowledge first that a mature faith does not necessarily come with age. The pressures that he's describing here can derail faith. It can lead people to bitterness. It can lead people to arrogance. It can lead people to pride. There's all sorts of ways that faith can be derailed in this journey when you face these kind of pressures. You can give in to despair. You can give in to just give up. These pressures can derail faith, and they can hold us back from maturing. Mature faith is not something that just comes with time. Just like my baseball team, some days they look like veterans with a lot of wisdom, and some days they just look old. And that's just not what we want. The anchor, though, of a mature faith for us is found in two things: humility and trust. It's the humility to see our own sin, to see the sin within, to see our constant, ever-present need for a Savior. Combining that humility with the trust to follow Him along the path that He leads us and to look to Him as our Redeemer. Humility and trust. Humility and the trust. The good news is that in the gospel, you have a covenant relationship with a good Father who guides and teaches and blesses, not because you're worthy, not because you've done enough, not because you haven't messed up too bad, but because of His steadfast love and faithfulness. Let Jesus teach you the way to maturity. The more you know Him, the more you know of Him, the more you can build your confidence in Him. Spend time with Him. Get to know Him. Humble yourself before Him. Learn from Him and follow. You are not finished yet. Let Jesus teach you the way to maturity. Let's pray. God, I thank you for this picture in Psalm 25 of a mature faith, of one that can lean on you and trust in your goodness and kindness no matter what life brings. And I pray for each of us. I pray for those who are in the midst of storms right now, who are facing challenges and maybe have in their head something less than that statement of faith, who have a hard time trusting you. I pray that the gospel will be clear, that they can trust in your goodness and kindness. Help them in humility trust you. I pray for all of us. I pray for those here who do not know you, that you will bend the heart, bend the knee, break the heart, that we can follow you, that we can trust you. Help us to teach us what it is to have a mature faith. In Jesus' name, amen. If we can help you in any way, please come while we stand and sing.
Great is thy faith.